So here we are at the site of Britain's first deep oil well in the parish of Tibshell. It later became known as HARDSTOFT number 1, HARDSTOFT because it's on the estates of the Duke of Devonshire's HARDSTOFT. This is the oil well that sprang to life in 1918, 1919. But the planning for it started very much earlier. By 1915, the government had decided that perhaps we should search for oil on British territory. Already, the British war machine, the military, was requiring far greater quantities of oil for military vehicles, but particularly for the Navy. It had been Winston Churchill, as the First Lord of the Admiralty, liaising with his first Sea Lord, Admiral Jackie Fisher, talking about changing the Navy ships from coal firing to oil firing, taking advantage of great advantages, advantages such as increase in speed, reduction in weight, reduced numbers of stokers, and it was particularly the increase in speed that was so important. Of course, the oil well at Tibshell here in Derbyshire wasn't the only one to be sunk in Britain at the same time. There were going to be 11 oil wells sunk the length and breadth of the country, or rather there were going to be 2 wells in the Lothian areas of Scotland, a couple of wells in the Potteries area of Staffordshire, and 7 wells sunk in Derbyshire. Sunk in Derbyshire because of the knowledge of the previous oil shows in coal mines and in lead mines across the county. The superintendent in charge of the operation was going to be Victor L. Conahan from the US Bureau of Mines. His geologist was going to be Eugene Ikes from the University of California, and the technical advisor is going to be Roderick Crandall, a famous geologist as we see later on, and he was from Stanford University. And they started this oil well, the building of the oil well. There were about 5 men, riggers from the US that worked on the oil well here, and they started at the sites identified. They started building the rig just here. They built a derrick about 85 foot high from tubular steel. The equipment that they'd brought in was not the rotary drilling equipment that you might have thought, but it was actually going to be percussion drilling equipment, where a great heavy chisel is hauled up the derrick and dropped down an increasingly deeper hole, releasing rocks at the bottom, which are then grabbed with material and then brought out. And it was going to take many months of the operation to succeed. The riggers lived on site here in 3 wooden huts, and there were also other local people living locally here. Some of the names are still well known to their family.
You have a relative that was involved with the oil well.
My father-in-law, he worked for the Duke on the Hardwick estate, yes, and there were 2 of them who used to come there to help the men erect the derricks. And all the derricks were erected by muscle power. There was no JCB in those days.
No.
So they needed some muscle, and of course coming from the estate they would know how to work.
And his name was?
Blanksby, William Blanksby.
I've seen photographs from your book in here regarding the oil well. Is this the information that you've wrote yourself regarding?
Oh yes, I've written all of those.
Right.
Yeah. But I was fortunate of having the photographs from the family.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
to accompany the writing.
So how long was he working at the oil well?
I think it was in 1927. It could be have been for 2 years. I'm not quite sure of that.
Yeah.
Because I have a photograph of him at the oil well.
Oh, that.
When they were putting the derrick up, he was not used to heights, not to that height anyway, of a derrick, and they were all put up one at a time, piece by piece.
Yeah.
And he was that used to heights. When he'd got to the top, he went to the top when they'd finished and stood on one foot, one leg with his arms stretched out like that. And the supervisor looking at him said when he came down, "That was all very nice, but don't do it again." Yeah.
It was going to take 7 months for this hole to start to spring to life. But at the same time that this was being dug, the other 7 wells, the other 6 wells within Derbyshire were also being spudded, one a month after the next one. So a month after this hole was spudded, a hole on the recreation ground at Brimington a little while later on was going to be spudded. 7 months later, overnight, on the 27th of May, this oil well started to spring to life. Already, the team were now 3,070 feet below ground. It had been a real struggle. So something like 7 barrels of oil a day is coming to the surface, getting on for 50 barrels of oil a week. All of it now starting to be collected in tanks on site. We know at Brimington already a 200,000 gallon capacity tank had been erected, and it's very likely that the same size of tank was erected on this site here. The oil was collected, and because the government were only intending to explore for oil and to see whether there was oil underneath Britain, they didn't have the necessary powers to sell this oil off to make a profit. So they collected it right through until 1920, and the first 500 tons of oil were sold off in 1920. So we're now transporting the oil from this oil well here by road tanker down to the local station, which is called Pilsley, and onto rail tankers, and then off up to Scotland to the Pumpherston oil refinery. By 1921, the government decides to see whether by pump tests they can increase the volumes of oil. And it was seen that they could increase the volumes of oil brought to the surface from 7 barrels a day to over 14 barrels a day. But because the government had not intended to sell oil at this stage, this wasn't instituted straight away. By 1922, the experts had started to move back to the US. Roderick Crandall, and then later on Victor L. Conahan, leaving behind the team to carry on the operation, which was now becoming routine. At the same time, the government had been trying to pass through Parliament a Petroleum Production Act, which would allow the oil to move into the hands of the estate, the landowners themselves. But that wasn't passed. It's at this time that all the other oil wells that had been sunk at this time were closed down, with the exception of one of the ones in Scotland, which for some months had showed promise of oil. So the well at Tibshelf carried on as the only one now producing oil. The government's Petroleum Production Act failed in its passage through Parliament, and this is the time that the Duke of Devonshire decided to place an injunction on the government, and he was allowed now following payment for the equipment, to now take over the operation, and also now for the future to be paid for the oil that is found on his land. By 1923, the Duke is now thinking of putting further oil wells on the land to see whether this area holds even more promise. And 2 further wells within a very short distance of us are to be erected. If this is HARDSTOFT number 1, its correct name, HARDSTOFT number 2 was actually erected just across the main road from us and in a field just a few hundred yards away from us. Although it did strike gas, and the gas, something like 20,000 cubic feet of gas a day, was used on this site, particularly for operating the boilers and for heating within the wooden huts. But there was to be no oil. A further well, HARDSTOFT number 3, was spudded in this direction, very close to Biggin Farm, which stands just about 600 or 700 yards away from us. Again, that was to be a disappointment. It struck not gas, not oil, but actually a vast amount of pressurized water, which flattened the casings, and the well had to be abandoned. Meanwhile, HARDSTOFT number 1 carried on to produce. In the later 20s, already a pipeline had been erected from one of the tanks on site here, leading downhill towards Pilsley Station, where the oil could now flow towards the tank cars and fill the tank cars for then taking off to the refinery. But again, towards the end of the 20s, the well started to silt up, and it started to show problems. And we understand that there was very limited oil won between the late 1920s and the late 1930s. But as the 1930s arrived, and the late 1930s, a lot more oil exploration was being carried out around the country. In North Derbyshire certainly, but particularly in North Nottinghamshire, just about 15 or 18 miles towards the east of us, within the bounds of Sherwood Forest, and the Eakring oil field sprung into life at the very beginning of the Second World War, 200 wells, and now Britain's second oil field now in operation.
So okay, you've bought a place. You knew there was an oil well here, so and you opened the landscape business.
Yeah.
So what did you call the business?
Well, it was, the deed's title was Oil Wells Cottages.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, that's an unusual name, so we'll call the nursery Oil Well Nursery as a location address.
Right.
And I thought, well, people will remember that name, which they did. It was a memorable thing. It sort of ignited interest amongst local people.
Oh, right. Who from?
I think largely to be forgotten. Probably parish council had probably forgotten about it.
Yeah.
And one of the councillors at the time, Mr. Ivan Brentnell,
Yeah.
I think he'd recently retired, and he decided to do some research into it. And he published a very interesting pamphlet that was eventually published in a little history magazine, local history magazine, the Ashfield Historian.
Right.
And they wanted to know full details about the oil well. I said, well, I can do better than that. I can show you this pamphlet, and that is published word for word. Alfred Brentnell's little pamphlet, published word for word in the Ashfield Historian. It was a very interesting little booklet.
So basically, for you putting a sign up there, we've got Oilwell Nurseries.
Yeah.
So how did the oil industry, the geologist, how did they get interested? What was the first contact?
Well, a couple of times they've been on TV because people have been fascinated by the name.
Yeah.
And when they looked into it in depth, they found that this was a site of Britain's first oil well.
And that's through you putting a sign out the front here?
Yeah,
that's
right.
amazing.
I said it'd be largely forgotten by that time.
Yeah. When was your first knowledge of the oil well in Tibshelf?
I knew the oil well in Tibshelf when I was a child,
Yeah.
because obviously it was half and half in production at the end of its life at that time. I never bothered anymore until I came across it when I was chairman of planning at Bolsover, because we got an issue with illegal tipping here, and then I knew more about it when Philip came here, and I was busy doing our Scout Centre gardens, and I was lucky because Philip's not a plant salesman, he's a nurseryman.
Yeah.
And so Philip, growing plants, used to talk to us a lot, and he used to give us lots of plants to plant down there and fill the garden up. And as a result of that conversation, I then decided, having retired from work early, that perhaps it was time that somebody recorded the history of our oil well here.
Oh, so did you approach Phil?
Well,
Yeah.
it was that article that fired my interest in this oil well, because up to then I had little interest in oil wells. I was more interested in plants. But that article you produced, which we then passed on to Ashfield Historian,
Yeah.
triggered my interest in it. And after that, with the illegal tipping, I've literally dug it out, and cleared it up, and see like it is now. So it was you that gave me the interest in the oil well.
It wasn't Philip that had done the illegal tipping, by the way. I must make that abundantly clear.
Yeah, so we had this, quite an amount of oil coming out, and I thought, crikey, we're going to be flooded with oil shortly. But it never got any worse. It was just. But apparently the oil's quite hot, 3,000 feet down, isn't it?
Yes, temperature starts to rise.
Yeah.
Miners, of course, tell you about the temperature underground,
Yes.
but we're a great deal deeper than most miners
Yes,
tend
yes,
to go.
yeah.
So yes, the temperatures
Would
are
it
a little bit
would it be
higher.
hot as you couldn't touch it, or would it be just quite warm?
I've never been down 3,000 feet, Philip, but I suspect you may well be right.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
I always find it so interesting to see the archaeology of this early oil well here.
Yes.
Yeah.
You tell me that the well pump was in this area down there.
Where we're standing now, where the camera is now, there's a concrete pad with two lines, and we assume that is where the running donkey was.
The thing that amazes me is sometimes you see no oil there, and sometimes you see a little puddle of oil as we've got here today. I don't think I've ever seen more oil than this.
No, that's quite a lot for what usually happens.
And this is a sample that you've taken not recently, but some
Just a
years
years
ago.
ago, yes,
Some
yes.
years ago, I think.
Yeah.
And the oil has actually been able to separate out.
yes.
And on the bottom you can see a water layer, and on the top you can see the oil. And if you shake that back together again, you actually end up with a totally emulsified oil, which again over time will
Yes.
actually now start
settle
to
Yes,
separate.
Yeah.
Um,
But yes, it's.
but there were a number of storage tanks here as well, Philip.
Well, we've got one left.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm not quite sure what volume it will be. Quite a bit. It's about 8 to 10 feet high.
Mm-hmm.
But that's still here.
But I don't think that would have been the major
No,
storage
no.
tank, because when the oil started to be exploited, it was some time before that oil was sent off
Yes.
to a refinery
Yes.
for treatment.
Yes. 'Cause
And there would have been a much bigger one here.
mm.
But you think you found the space where that might have been?
Well, there's a semicircle in the wood
Mm.
amongst all the trees. So you can define it. It's just half of it left,
Yeah.
But that must be. We often wondered why would they put a tank there when they've already got a big one. But that's probably the reason.
Yeah. Well, at Brimington, the Brimington well a few miles further north, We know that there was a 200,000 gallon tank installed there, and I suspect your tank here would have been a similar size to that.
Well, they've been expecting big things of this well. I mean, do you think they put a big tank there because we're going to get lots of oil, and it wasn't quite as much as they thought? Do you think that's a possibility?
I suspect at the time that the tanks were being built, it was a matter of, I wonder how much is going to come out here.
Yeah.
Who knows? But they tell me that the amount of oil that came out here was similar to the amount of oil that was coming out of the oil fields in Pennsylvania and Texas.
It was actually high grade oil. That's why it was
very high grade oil. Yeah, and it was particularly good for steam engines. Of course, all the trains were steam, so it was good for them.
Indeed, it was a very high grade oil. It was actually a very light oil. You've mentioned the smell of the oil. The smell of this oil is actually quite light. It's quite a sweet smelling oil. It's not a heavy sulphurous oil that comes from some other parts of the world. So the sulphur level here is not as high as many others, and therefore the smell is much less.
Yeah. I think it was sometime in the late 80s, probably 1987, 1988. There was a new parish council with many new members on, and we decided that we wanted to do certain things, probably to make a little bit of an impact on the village. And one of these projects was to erect new and unique village signs. The idea came from one of the newer councillors, Ray Heffer, and at his suggestion it was agreed that included in the name of the, or included in the village signs, not only was the name of Tibshelf, but also words to the effect that Tibshelf was the site of the first inland oil well in the United Kingdom. And those signs were duly erected, paid for by the parish council, and they still stand to this day, proudly proclaiming our heritage as far as oil production is concerned.
So Cliff, what happened leading up to the Second World War?
Well, I think it's incredible. Here we are at the site of the only producing oil well in Britain. We're in the 1930s, and the government's gone to sleep. We're approaching another world war, and this is still the only producing oil well in Britain. I think the Duke of Devonshire was quite correct when he got the Darcy Petroleum Company to start to clean out the well and once again get this well back into operation again. And it was to carry on in operation, producing oil right through to the end of the Second World War, right through to 1945. It produced perhaps something like another 9,000 barrels of oil during that time. A flea bite in terms of what we needed, but a tremendous confidence booster.
I am right in saying this, that the oil was, the government actually paid for the oil then, didn't it? Because the Duke of Devonshire owned the land.
Yes, already the first acts had been repealed, and as it turned out, the Duke of Devonshire, by the end of the Second World War, was the only person that owned the oil rights to the oil well on his land. No other landowner in Britain by that time still owned the rights to the oil underneath their own land. Quite an interesting thought.
It is. I mean, that's even today, but this is the only oil well, isn't it, in the UK that's actually privately owned.
As I understand it, it's the only site of a well which had produced revenue from the oil for the landowner, and it's a great shame that it finally came to an end at the end of the Second World War. But then everything needs to come to an end.
So when did they actually cap it?
Well, it carried on producing a small amount of oil until 45. And I gather it dribbled for some years later, but the oil wasn't sold off. And by 1952 it was decided that the well should be correctly capped, and that's what happened. And eventually the oil became the oil well nursery as we know now. One of the local lubricant manufacturers in Derbyshire.
Yeah.
Silcoline Lubricants
Yeah.
apparently were one of the ones involved at the time. I suspect not in the capping because they didn't have the expertise,
Right.
but actually they would be very interested in
Yeah.
the taking down the tanks, the lines, the business that they already knew about pumping.
I mean, obviously
pumping oil.
we don't know the full story, but as I said off camera, do you think there's a possibility that Silcoline got the contract to close it, but probably you said it could have been.
I suspect it's more likely that Darcy Petroleum were the ones that actually
Right.
had the contract to close it,
Yeah.
but were very happy of the services of a local oil company within the county here.
Obviously,
Darcy
yeah.
Petroleum by this time, by the way,
Yeah.
were starting to sink the great raft of oil wells that were to follow in
Yeah.
Sherwood Forest at Eakring, and the first of those came into operation as Britain's Second World War was to start.
Is that one of the largest inland at that time? You know, for the Second World War, that was making a major
It was
effort.
the largest inland
Yeah.
oil field at the time, and something like 200 oil wells were spudded in Sherwood Forest, and it was one of the greatest secrets of the Second World War.
Yeah.
But of course, the fact that we were getting oil from this well here
Yeah.
was also one of the great secrets.
Yeah. Before we close, you actually worked for Silcoline.
Yes, I was technical manager of Silcoline and carried on with them as they were right until I retired 5-6 years ago.